Welcome back. We'll finish up our reproductive system here with the female reproductive side of things. So just a quick review of what we saw before in the last video. So female sex hormones are going to be cyclical, so they're going to have essentially an up and down process in terms of increases, and those increases also need to occur at very specific times throughout the cycle, and we'll talk about those towards the end of the talk here. And so, as we saw before, with the production of egg cells, once it's ovulated and is ready for fertilization, that's the goal of the first half of the reproductive cycle for females. And so we begin with essentially the maturation of the egg. That's going to go along in the first half. Essentially prepare both the egg as well as the uterus for implantation. And so that once ovulation does occur about midway through the cycle, we're going to have the endometrium of the uterus ready for potential implantation. If fertilization has occurred, then implantation can occur. Or if not, then we're going to move over to menstruation and begin the cycle all over again. So we're going to start over at the same process, move back up to the maturing of another egg, and essentially begin again. Get ready for this to potentially happen the next time around. And so, as said, this process does require the use of hormones to control the individual processes at very specific times throughout the cycle itself. Just like in the male, this all begins with our gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is then going to have a positive effect on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then is going to release our FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Back when we talked about the males, we said that these were essentially named after or with the female in mind, and we'll see that come to fruition this time around as well. And so with the release of FSH, we can go down to essentially the follicle and stimulate the follicle, as its name implies, and then go down to the ovary as well. And our luteinizing hormone is going to help out with the corpus luteum in the end as well. For that FSH and LH, that's going to come down to the reproductive system for the female, and its primary targets are going to be a positive effect on the ovaries as well as the endometrium of the uterus. So if you remember back to the anatomical structures that we're talking about in anatomy, the uterus itself has multiple layers to it, and essentially the functional layer is going to be the endometrium itself, and then the endometrium has two layers within it, and we're going to have that functional layer constantly grow and be sloughed off with each cycle itself. In the ovaries, we're going to stimulate one of these follicles to start to mature. So we're going to go through the maturation process and get that follicle to become matured so that we have an egg that can then be ovulated and head down through the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes as they make their way through there. So the whole job of the ovaries in terms of the beginning part of the cycle is to mature a follicle. And so the follicle is going to mature, and inside that follicle there is an egg. And so we have an oocyte. That oocyte is going to go through some different changes that we saw back in anatomy as well, as far as going through the from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte to where it can then be ovulated within there. The ovaries, in response to our rising levels of FSH and LH, are going to start to secrete more estrogen. Those estrogen levels, as they rise, are going to have a positive effect on both FSH and LH as well. And so if we were to look at, and we will later on, the levels of FSH and LH, if we have day 0 here and day 28 over here, those FSH and LH levels are going to essentially rise and peak just before ovulation. And so that surge in hormones has to occur just before ovulation does. And so if we don't see a surge, especially in luteinizing hormone, we don't get ovulation. So that can be sometimes a source for infertility in some women, is they don't have that LH surge mid-cycle. Quick little review here of our secondary follicle as it's beginning to develop. And so inside here, we have our oocyte. So we have our primary oocyte inside the follicle. The follicle itself is surrounded by cells. And so we have this growing follicle that is inside there. Two sets of cells surrounding it. We have our granulosa cells creating a thick layer of cells. And then we have our zona pellucida that surrounds the very outside of the oocyte. And so as it is developing there as well. This is going to continue to differentiate, and as that follicle begins to grow, it starts to fill a space inside called the antrum, and this becomes filled with fluid. And so there's fluid filling the inside. That fluid is going to be what's going to be utilized to actually propel the ovulated oocyte out from the follicle and into the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes that's there. We see those granulosa cells continuing to grow in and around. They're producing hormones as they are developing as well. So those granulosa cells continue to form and essentially create kind of like a sac on the outside. So we have a barrier that is outside that helps to hold in all of the fluid that's inside the antrum there. And as that fluid sits inside there, again, our now secondary oocyte is well on its way to being developed. It's going through its rest of its cell divisions in order to make our secondary oocyte at this point. We continue on from there. And now this oocyte is our secondary oocyte. It is matured. It is essentially relatively large as far as the overall follicle is concerned. That follicle is almost all antrum and relatively little ovum or secondary oocyte. But this follicle is ready to rupture. You can think about it as kind of a gross way to think about it is kind of like a pimple that's there and the whole bunch of fluid that's underneath there. You can think about it as a balloon that's ready to burst and pop on the surface as well. And when it does so, it's going to take this ovum with it. And so the secondary oocyte is going to be cast out at this point as the surface ruptures. And so the ovarian surface itself is going to tear open. It's going to open up and we're going to get ovulation. When this occurs, the oocyte is cast out and two components are left with it in terms of cells. We have the corona radiata, and then we still have the zona pellucida that is there in terms of those cells, and that's going to go with the oocyte on its way. The fluid is going to move out with it. We have the fallopian tube, the uterine tube there, ready to catch it, and hopefully it makes its way into the tube itself, and it can be on its way down through the tube and into the uterus. Along the way there, sperm cells potentially going to fertilize it and enter into that structure as well. So the whole fertilization process here we can see in a different picture that for ovulation, all of this excess here that's on it, this is all the components that are ejected with the oocyte. And so it is kind of a huge process. Sometimes in females, when ovulation does occur, they can actually feel it. They get a little twinge of pain called Mittelschmerz, and that twinge of pain signals the release of that oocyte. And now it's going to travel and be on its way down through the uterine tubes over the next several days. Back in the ovary, however, the follicle is going to start to go through some changes. And so it starts to make its way through some changes, and it starts to develop into what we call a corpus luteum. And so this is where luteinizing hormone comes into play. And so luteinizing hormone, or LH hormone, is going to continue to stimulate the follicle. And as it does so, the follicle itself, the corpus, meaning body, and luteum, meaning yellow, describes essentially what it looks like. And so if we were to look inside an ovary, we would see this yellow body kind of sitting inside there. That corpus luteum, as it continues to develop, it's closed up, it's kind of walled itself off, and all of the little cells in this little yellow area here are starting to produce hormones. And so they're starting to produce estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, which is going to then allow us to decrease the potential for another ovulation. And so it's not a perfect system. It does happen where ovulation can occur even after pregnancy has occurred as well. But that corpus luteum is designed that if implantation of an embryo does occur, we're going to get the continued production of estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, so that we don't get another ovulation, and so that the endometrium stays intact. And so the production of the endometrium is going to need to stay intact. It's going to need to continue to grow, but we want to inhibit FSH and LH so that we don't have another ovulation beginning, so that the endometrium stays the way that it is. If implantation occurs, then that corpus luteum is going to continue to produce hormones all the way through that first trimester. So here we have now a well-developed corpus luteum. It's kicking out hormones. It's sending those estrogens and progesterone out of the cells there, and it's being ejected, I forgot my E there, from that corpus luteum. And if pregnancy occurs, this corpus luteum is going to stick around. If pregnancy does not occur, so we don't get implantation, then we're going to have a problem. It's going to stay around as long as that corpus luteum starts to receive signals from another hormone called our human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. And HCG is going to be the hormone that stimulates the corpus luteum to remain intact. And so this is going to be there. HCG is also the hormone that we're going to look for early pregnancy tests. So that's the hormone that's now being secreted. It's going to be found in the female's urine and can be detected, as well as being detected and stimulating the corpus luteum. If instead of that process occurring where we get ovulation, somewhere within the next 2 days or so we get fertilization, and so the sperm cells, the egg cell, typically have, when we read the books, they say as much as 72 hours for the two of them to kind of come together. But there are many, many cases out there where sperm has been in the female and can live upwards of 5 days or even more in some. So simply abstaining in and around that ovulation period does not always guarantee. So even if you had, in a sense, intercourse on day 10 and ovulation is going to occur on day 14, if those sperm cells can live for 5 days, there's a high probability that fertilization could potentially occur. But at some point, fertilization may occur and the sperm enters into the egg. The two of them are going to fuse, and then they're going to start to develop cell upon cell upon cell. And we looked at this in anatomy. And over the next 6 days or so, we're going to get to the point where potentially we get implantation of our morula. And so we get the cells themselves all growing. We've now got an inner mass of cells. We've got the trophoblast cells that are on the outside that are going to become part of the placenta, the inner mass of cells becoming the actual fetus itself, and that's going to allow for implantation. Now those cells, do the trophoblast here, now start to produce our HCG. And so that gets produced. That's going to feed back to the ovary, and that corpus luteum that had developed in here change my color to yellow. So we have our corpus luteum in there somewhere, and that's going to receive signals then from the HCG that say maintain yourself, and then the corpus luteum is then going to produce the estrogen and progesterone. And so the two of them are now going to be being produced in higher quantities, and that's going to then signal the endometrium to be maintained. It's going to inhibit FSH and LH, and so we maintain the uterus and the endometrium throughout the course of that first trimester that's there. So if fertilization does not occur or implantation does not occur, we could have potentially fertilization without implantation on there, and that could potentially occur as well. If that doesn't occur, the corpus luteum is going to start to break down, and it's going to start to form a corpus albicans. And so since that corpus luteum is no longer being functional, that means that we're going to decrease the amount of estrogen and progesterone that's being produced, which means that then also FSH and LH is no longer being inhibited, and so those hormones can be increased, and that's going to lead to the shedding of the endometrium. So the endometrium is going to die off, that functional layer, and that's going to get sloughed off and lost during the menstrual cycle. And so in a sense, we've gone full circle with the cycle itself, and that continues from there. So here we have a corpus luteum that's degenerating. It's essentially decreasing. This is becoming less and less functional as far as the cells that are inside there, and that is decreasing the amount of production of estrogen and progesterone. So our estrogen and our progesterone are decreasing, and that's going to lead to an increase in FSH and LH. So here we can see that those hormone levels do cycle throughout the cycle itself. And so we have estrogen, progesterone levels. Estrogen levels are going to increase just before ovulation occurs, and that's going to drive the surge of luteinizing hormone and FSH, which occurs at ovulation. So ovulation is going to occur at typically day 14. And so at day 14, we're going to get this surge in LH. This is going to lead to that ovulation, and then over the course of the next couple of days, we're going to have the corpus luteum producing those increased levels of estrogen and progesterone. That's going to be then inhibiting luteinizing hormone and FSH, and that's going to keep those suppressed. If implantation does not occur, so typically we have roughly 6 days or so for implantation to occur. If implantation does occur, then the progesterone levels and estrogen levels will stay leveled off, and so they'll stay elevated at that point. But if implantation doesn't occur, that means there's no HCG. If there's no HCG, our estrogen levels and progesterone levels fall, and once they get down to essentially their basal level, then we can start to have FSH and LH levels come back up. That's going to lead to the destruction of the endometrium, and essentially we're back at the beginning for menstruation. And here we can see the ovary as well as the endometrium kind of imposed with one another throughout the course of the cycle as well. And so with that, we have the FSH, or the estrogen and progesterone levels, have been inclining, and with that we get the production of the endometrium, so that is increasing their production that's there. FSH and LH levels began to surge here at day 14, and as they occurred, we then got ovulation. The corpus luteum is going to give us our estrogen and progesterone levels increased. As we get degeneration of the corpus luteum, we're going to get an increase in FSH and LH levels there once again, and that's going to lead to the degeneration of the endometrium and the eventual death of the endometrium with the beginning of the next cycle as it goes there. So menstruation is occurring there at day 28. We have the blood vessels kinking off, dying off, and the tissue being sloughed off from that point. For female reproduction, we once again have a large negative feedback system that is in play, much like that of the male, except this one's a little bit more complicated than what we had for the male. So where we have the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, we're going to have a positive effect on the release of FSH and LH. FSH and LH is going to go down to both the ovary and the endometrium. This is going to cause the follicle to begin to mature. And so this is going to generate a secondary oocyte, or our egg. It's going to cause the endometrium to thicken. And so the endometrium is going to grow and increase in size, getting ready for implantation to occur. The ovaries are going to be stimulated by that FSH and LH to increase levels of estrogen and progesterone. And as especially that estrogen level rises, that's going to lead to our surge in FSH and LH. And so those levels are going to rise up as the estrogen level tanks, in a sense, kind of just before that. That leads to our ovulation. Ovulation then gives us the production of a corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is going to be active if implantation occurs. So if implantation occurs, we end up with a embryo that is implanted, and the embryo is now going to be producing our human gonadotropic hormone. So we have human chorionic gonadotropin. That is then going to feed back to the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is going to continue to produce estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. That is then going to feed back to the decreased production of FSH and LH. And so that's going to stop their production. And this is going to maintain the endometrium, maintain the site essentially for pregnancy to occur. If pregnancy does not occur, so if we don't get implantation, then there is no HCG. With no HCG, we have no continuation of the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum starts to break down. That leads to a decrease in estrogen and progesterone, which then leads to an increase in FSH and LH. And then from that point on, that increased FSH and LH feeds us all the way back up to the system once again. And so we lead to the production then of our normal hormones. And with that, we kind of finish up our look at the female reproductive cycle, as well as with everything in the course itself.